Hello students, welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Welcome to a session on the discussion on various important newspaper articles that have appeared in the business newspapers. In this particular discussion, the reference period that I'll be taking will be from 28th September to 5th October 2018. And the articles that I've chosen will be from Hindu, Financial Express, Live Mint, Business Line, Business Standard, etc. So let's start with this particular discussion. The first article that I've taken is a very important article that relates to or that discusses the concept of RBI easing the SLR norms. Now, the discussion that I'll be having over various articles will have three very important components. One, what are the basic points that you need to understand this particular article? Second, why this article or why this particular issue is there in the newspaper? Third, what is the analysis of this particular article? Let me start with the basic points. To understand this article, you need to understand three very important concepts. One is SLR, and the second one is FALLR, CR. Third one is CP, that is commercial paper. Let me start with the first one, SLR. RBI to regulate the money supply in the market uses many tools under the monetary policy. The two most important tools that are used by RBI are statutory requirement, which are basically the cash reserve ratio, statutory liquidity ratio. This particular article is related to statutory liquidity ratio. Now, what is SLR? Every bank will collect the demand deposits as well as time deposits. The sum total of the demand deposits as well as time deposits after adjusting for interbank deposits is referred to as NDTL, net demand and time liabilities. Out of this particular net demand and time liabilities, RBI mandates every bank to maintain certain percentage either in the form of G securities or in the form of gold or in the form of cash. I'll repeat it. Out of the total NDTL that is collected by the banks, certain percentage has to be maintained in the form of either cash, in the form of a gold or in the form of G securities. This particular ratio is called as statutory liquidity ratio. Presently, the mandate of RBI is that every bank should maintain 19.5% of their NDTL in the form of the gold, in the form of G securities or in the form of cash. Second one is FALLCR. But before understanding FALLCR, let's understand the concept of LCR. LCR basically stands for liquidity coverage ratio. All of us have gone through the basic articles related to Basel guidelines, which are being implemented in case of India, under which there are certain ratios with respect to the liquidity maintained in each of the banks. One of the ratio that has been mandated under the Basel guidelines is LCR, liquidity coverage ratio. Under liquidity coverage ratio, the Basel guideline mandates every bank to maintain sufficient high liquid assets to meet the demand for 30 days liquidity. In simple terms, every bank must maintain sufficient liquid assets to meet the demands for the next 30 days. That is the liquidity coverage ratio. And using this particular liquidity coverage ratio, RBI has introduced FALLCR, which basically stands for Facility to Avail Liquidity under Liquidity Coverage Ratio, under which RBI says that under SLR, what securities that you have purchased of the government, you can pledge it back to RBI to get the liquidity. I'll repeat it. What securities the banks have purchased under SLR, that is G securities, they can again pledge it back to RBI to get the liquidity. Earlier, under FALLCR, RBI had given an option of pledging up to 11% of NDTL, which are in the form of G securities, which the banks can pledge to RBI and get the liquidity. So that is concept of FALLCR. And the third one is commercial papers. Concept of commercial papers is nothing but the companies can use these particular instruments which they can issue in the market and collect money. But very important feature of a commercial paper is that these are short-term instruments. In simple terms, the maturity of the commercial papers cannot be more than 1 year. Or in the newspapers, they'll use the term up to 1 year. So these are the three very basic points you need to understand before reading this particular article. Now, why this particular issue was in the newspaper? In the recent times, it has been seen that because of Island FS issue, because of outflow of FPI in the market, and because of various other issues, there has been a huge liquidity shortage in the Indian market. Now, to ensure that there is a sufficient liquidity in the market, RBI has very recently relaxed SLR norms under FALLCR. Now, what is this particular issue? Let's analyze this. As earlier mentioned, RBI has introduced FALLCR, under which banks can pledge their G securities to whom? To RBI, and RBI will provide liquidity to these particular banks. Now, we have already seen that there is a shortage of liquidity in the market, as a result of which, understand this, whenever there is a shortage of liquidity, money supply becomes lesser. Whenever money supply becomes lesser, the lending rates or the interest rates in the market will keep on increasing. It has been seen in case of commercial papers, because on one side liquidity is coming down, but the demand for money has increased. As a result of this, the investors are asking for higher rate of interest for every commercial papers that they are purchasing. So we have seen that the commercial papers rate of interest or the coupon rate has increased in the last couple of weeks. So what RBI has done is basically relaxed this particular provision of SLR under the FALLCR. What RBI has done is, earlier they had asked every bank, or they had told every bank that they can pledge up to 11% of their NDTL, which are in the form of the G securities, could be pledged to RBI and they can get the money for short term. But now RBI has increased this particular percentage from 11% to 13%, which basically means that now the banks can pledge extra volume of G securities or extra G securities with RBI, get the liquidity to meet the short-term liquidity under the liquidity coverage ratios. Now, since it has been increased from 11% to 13%, it is expected that the liquidity infusion into the market will be more than 2.5 lakh crore rupees. But remember this, apart from the G securities being pledged under the FALLCR, they can also pledge the G securities under another instrument called as a marginal standing facility. Now, what is the concept of marginal standing facility? If a bank requires, let's say, X amount of crore rupees for overnight purposes. What do you mean by overnight purposes? Every bank has to maintain certain cash in their vault at the end of the day. But imagine a situation where a bank is supposed to maintain 100 crore rupees, but it is falling short by 2 crore rupees. In this particular situation, they just need to ensure that by the end of the day, they infuse a cash of around 2 crore rupees. In this particular situation, the bank can simply approach RBI, pledge the G securities and get the infusion of the liquidity. This particular infusion of liquidity for short-term duration is called as a marginal standing facility. And remember this, RBI basically says that not all your cash requirement will be satisfied under the marginal standing facility. For example, if your NDTL is 100 crore rupees, then only 2% of this will be given by RBI under the marginal standing facility. That is, a bank could require 6 crore rupees to meet the liquidity criteria. But the RBI simply says, since your NDTL is only 100 crore rupees, I will give you a maximum of 2% of it, which will be 2 crore rupees. This particular tool using which the banks can borrow for overnight purposes or for short-term purposes from RBI is called as marginal standing facility. So in simple terms, how much of the G securities which are held by a bank under SLR can be pledged with RBI? Under FALLCR, now the banks can pledge 13% of their NDTL, and under the marginal standing facility, they can pledge 2% of their SLRs. So basically, the sum total will be how much? 15%. So the banks will be allowed to pledge up to 15% of the SLRs which they are holding in the form of G securities to pledge with RBI and to get the short-term liquidity. So this is a basic understanding of this particular article. The next article is related to agriculture sector, which had appeared in Live Mint. Now, before understanding this particular article, the basic points you need to understand will be agriculture census as well as the concept of landholding. Now, once in every 5 years, the Ministry of Agriculture since 1970s has been conducting this particular concept of agriculture census, in which basically they will find out what has been the concept of a land holdings in India. Now, the land holdings simply means what has been the situation of farming units in case of India. Have the number of farm units or cultivable units of land increased, decreased? If yes, under which category? So on and so forth. Let's try and understand these particular concepts. Under land holdings, we will measure the land holdings under 5 heads. One is marginal land holding, small land holding, semi-medium, medium and large. Usually the marginal will represent a land holding or size of the farming unit which is less than 1 hectare or up to 1 hectare. And small means more than 1 hectare but up to 2 hectare. Semi-medium represents more than 2 hectare but up to 4 hectare. Medium represents more than 10 hectare up to 10 hectare. And large basically represents more than 10 hectare. So whenever the agriculture census is conducted, the land units which are used for cultivation purposes will be kept under this particular classification. And the total number will be referred as operational holdings. Now, what has been the situation with respect to operational holdings in India? Let's try and understand. So, why this particular issue is there in the newspaper? One, you need to understand this. Over the last couple of years, the agriculture sector has fallen into a lot of distress. Lot of protests have been happening in the present context itself. The government of India, to calm or to pacify the farmers, has even increased the MSP for Kharif crops as well as Rabi crops. But this particular agriculture census for the year 15 and 16, the data was recently announced. So that is the precise reason it was there in the newspaper. So what has been the findings of this particular census? Let's try and understand. First, the number of small and marginal units account for 86.2% of the total units. But in terms of the land size, the total land size will account for 47.3% of the total land which is under cultivation. Second, semi-medium and medium land holdings account for 13.2% of the total land holdings, and the total land is 43.6% of the total land under cultivation. Large holdings are 0.6% of the total land holdings in India, whereas they account for around 9% of the total land under cultivation. So what is the inference that you can draw from this particular census numbers? As already mentioned, agriculture sector is already under a lot of stress. And if you see these particular numbers, that is especially for small and marginal land holdings, in the census of 2011, this accounted for 85.9% of the total land holdings. And in a span of 5 years itself, it has increased to 86.2%. Rather than looking at just percentage increase, more importantly, the number of land holdings have increased by 9 million units, which is much more consequential in nature. Because please understand, whenever the land holdings will become fragmented like this, the earnings of the farmers will also keep on getting affected. Already the farmers are under a lot of pressure because of non-availability of institutional credit, because of erratic monsoon, because of market variation or market fluctuation in terms of prices. And upon that, if the land gets fragmented more and more, the cost of inputs are going to increase, whereas their incomes are going to decrease. That is a precise reason it is said that in case of India, majority of the cultivation or majority of the farming is subsistence farming, wherein substantial part of the production done by small and marginal farmers will be kept for self-consumption, whereas the commercial cultivation, which will lead to higher incomes for the farmers, is only done on large farming units. So what Government of India needs to do is ensure that cooperative farming becomes more and more practiced in case of India. So this is the basic gist of this particular article. The third article is related to increase the MSP for Rabi crops. Now floor price is also referred as MSP. This appeared on 4th of October. What are the important basic concepts you need to understand? First and foremost, you need to understand what is the concept of MSP. MSP basically stands for the minimum support price. What is the concept of a minimum support price? Government of India announces MSP on 23 agriculture commodities, which basically means the Government of India is announcing the floor price. Earlier, the concept of MSP was if the market prices of these particular commodities fall down, then the government would enter into market, procure these particular food grains. And that is also is expected from the farmers. But please understand, some of the other things that you need to understand is, one, CSEP, that is Commission for Agriculture Cost and Prices, will recommend this particular MSP to Government of India. Earlier, the CSEP used to consider various factors such as input cost, such as the market prices, such as supply and demand forces, such as international supply of these particular commodities, so that they can arrive at the MSP which they would recommend to Government of India, and Government of India would then announce the MSP based on this. But very recently, Government of India has basically stated that henceforth the MSP that will be announced will be at least 150% of cost of production. Or else, in simple terms, they will also mention that it will be 50% over the cost of production. Now, what is the cost of production? Usually, to calculate the cost of production, there are three formulas which are referred as A2, A2 plus FL, and C2. C2 is also referred as comprehensive costing. Now, please understand, in case of A2, the cost of inputs such as the cost or the expenditure incurred on fertilizer, expenditure incurred on purchasing of diesel, expenditure incurred on purchasing of seeds, so on and so forth will be taken into consideration. Whereas in case of A2 plus FL, along with A2 cost, they will also mention FL. FL basically stands for family labor. In certain situations, we end up using family labor or family member in the form of a labor on the field. But we never do pay for these particular labor, whereas other labor that we have hired, we actually end up paying. So when we calculate A2 plus FL, apart from A2 cost, we will also calculate the imputed cost on the family labor. Whereas in case of C2, apart from A2 plus FL, we will also calculate the cost of capital in the form of, let's say, interest or in the form of a land. That is, let's assume I've used 1 lakh rupees out of my own pocket for cultivation purposes. Whereas if I had basically lent this particular 1 lakh rupees in the market, I would have earned certain interest. So what is the opportunity cost or the cost of this kind of a capital? All of it will be considered in the form of C2. In essence, you can understand that C2 will be bigger than A2 plus FL, which will be bigger than A2. The most quoted recommendation of MS Swaminathan Committee report basically says that the Government of India must announce the MSP which is equivalent to 150% of cost of production, but this particular cost of production should be nothing but C2. But Government of India says that we will not consider C2, rather we will consider A2 plus FL. So basically, to recap the issue, CSEP will recommend the MSP based on the cost of production to Government of India. Government of India will announce this particular MSP. Sometimes UPSC, just to confuse you, may use the term CCEA rather than Government of India. CCEA basically stands for Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs. So these are some of the basic points. Why it was there in the newspaper? After the farmers protested in Delhi against the Government of India's policies in the agriculture sector, the Government of India announced the increase in the MSP for Rabi commodities. Now please understand, it is not the first time that the Government of India has announced this kind of a hike. Even before, that is during the Kharif season also, the Government of India has announced the hike in the MSP. But the analysis part is that this particular increase in the MSP will not provide a huge benefit for the farmers. Because one, the Government of India, although announces MSP for 23 agriculture commodities, will not procure all these particular commodities. It majorly procures rice and wheat. Second, not all the farmers will get the benefit of MSP. For example, one, majority of the procurement done by FCI, that is rice and wheat, will be concentrated in surplus states because they produce a lot of it. Second, not all the farmers in the surplus states will get the benefit of MSP. Let's say a marginal farmer who has cultivated 9 bags of paddy will not take all the 9 bags of paddy and travel 30 kilometers to FCI godown to sell it, because the distance becomes a problem. Third, in many of the states, MSP is announced, procurement is also done, but the payment of MSP is delayed. So if you are a farmer who who is a marginal farmer, you will basically say, I want the money right now. So what you will do, rather than selling it to FCI, you will make your own arrangements and sell it in the open market. Because of all of these particular issues, the Niti Aayog report basically says that although more than 81% of the farmers in India have the idea of what is MSP, more than 2/3 of the farmers, that is more than 67% of the farmers, actually end up selling the food grains, making their own arrangements. And Shanta Kumar committee basically said that only around 6% of the farmers in India actually get the benefit of MSP. So these are some of the issues with respect to this announcement of MSP. Next article is related to the Government of India's borrowing. The Government of India very recently has announced that in the second half of this particular financial year, they will reduce the borrowing by 70,000 crore rupees. Now, some of the basic points that you need to understand this particular article will be the concept of a fiscal deficit. Now, understand this. During the presentation of a budget, the Government of India will tell how much expenditure they are going to incur as well as how much receipts they are going to collect. Now, when I say receipts in the concept of budget, it simply means incomes of the government. Obviously, the expenditure will be higher compared to the receipts. So, there will be a deficit here. To bridge this particular deficit, Government of India borrows from the market. How does it borrow from the market? By issuing, let's say, government securities. How much of these particular government securities are issued depends how much is the deficit. And this particular G securities which are issued when measured against GDP is called as fiscal deficit. Let's say hypothetically, our GDP value is 200 rupees and we have decided to issue 10 rupee worth of a G security. Then basically the FD will be 5%. So this is how the fiscal deficit will be calculated. And that is a precise reason Finance Minister, when announces the budget on the floor of the Lok Sabha, will also tell us how much is going to borrow from the market in this particular financial year. What is the importance of this particular borrowing? Please understand this. Government of India will have a huge amount of expenditure to incur. One kind of expenditure will be revenue expenditure and the other kind of expenditure will be capital expenditure. Under revenue expenditure, usually they will incur expenditures mainly in the form of interest payments, in the form of subsidies, in the form of pensions, so on and so forth. Whereas in the form of capital expenditure, the main expenditure will be the repayment of the loans as well as the investment in infrastructure. So whenever the government needs to ensure this kind of expenditure, they will have to ensure that this particular deficit is met with the borrowings in the market. Now, why it is there in the newspaper? Basically, the finance minister has recently announced that in the second half, the Government of India will reduce its borrowing in the market by 70,000 crore rupees. What is the analysis of this particular news? One, if Government of India says that they would reduce the borrowings in the market, it simply means that one, they are either going to reduce the expenditure or they are going to collect more receipts, or it could be both of them. Now, in this particular context, the Government of India says that on one side, the receipts in the form of direct taxes have increased. In the period from April to August, the Government of India has collected more direct tax receipts than the estimates. So, in simple terms, the receipts or the incomes of the Government of India have increased on this side. Whereas on the other side, although there is a worry that, or there is a concern by various experts that the subsidy in the form of the kerosene as well as the LPG will overshoot the estimations, the Government of India said that they will be able to control the expenditure. That is the precise reason why Government of India has said that they would reduce the borrowings by 70,000 crore rupees. Now, having said so, already the estimates are that the subsidy for LPG and kerosene, which was around 25,000 crore rupees for this particular financial year, will be more than 46,000 crore rupees. Whether it will pan out or not, we will have to wait and see. But having said so, what is the implication of this in the market? So when this announcement was made, basically we saw that the commercial paper interest rates declined. The lending rates in the market on various securities also to a certain extent were reduced. What is the connection? Please understand this. Whenever Government of India increases the borrowings, suddenly announces a huge borrowing from the market, the lending rates or the interest rates on various securities will also increase. And when Government of India reduces its borrowing, basically these interest rates on various securities will also decrease. What is the correlation? What is the connection? Simple logic is that let's assume there are two companies as well as the government who wanted to borrow from the market. Now, if the supply is let's say 100 rupees, since the number of people who are demanding this particular 100 rupees will be higher, the interest rates will be higher. Now, if Government of India simply says, I'm going to drop it from the race, I'm not going to borrow any more in the market, can I simply say the number of borrowers in the market have come down? And since the number of borrowers comes down, the lending rates or the interest rates on these particular securities will also come down. That is the precise reason we saw that with Government of India announcing the reduction in the borrowing for the second half of this particular financial year, the interest rates on various securities also calm down in the market. That is a basic relation between the borrowings of the government as well as the interest rates in the market. So this is the basic analysis of this article. The next article is related to the state finance commissions. Some of the basic points that you need to understand is finance commission, devolution, tied and untied funds. First, let me start with the tied and untied funds. Tied funds means central government will transfer certain funds to, let's say, to the state, and the state government will utilize the funds. If the central government says, I will give you 100 rupees, use it only for sanitation purposes or construction of infrastructure for sanitation, these kind of funds are called as tied funds. And if central government says, I will give you 100 rupees, use it for any infrastructure that you want to develop, these kind of funds are called as untied funds. What is the importance? We'll understand in some time. Finance Commission. Under Article 280, the President of India, once every 5 years, will appoint a Finance Commission. The most important recommendation which are given by Finance Commission to the central government are with respect to devolution. What do you mean by devolution? Central government, under the powers given by Constitution of India, will impose various direct taxes as well as indirect taxes and will collect it. Let's say a direct tax such as income tax as well as a corporate tax. The central government will implement these particular taxes uniformly across India and will collect the receipts from it. But don't you think the states should also have certain claim over these particular taxes? Yes. The role of the Finance Commission, or the most important role of the Finance Commission, is how should these particular taxes be distributed between center as well as the states. That concept is called as devolution. What happens is these direct taxes as well as indirect taxes which are collected by the central government will be pooled into an account called as divisible pool of taxes. Out of these particular divisible pool of taxes, how much should be going to the central government, how much should go to the states as a group. And after this, how much should go to the state 1, state 2, so on and so forth till state 29. This particular first recommendation, which basically ensures the distribution of divisible pool of taxes between center and states, is called as vertical devolution formula. And on the other side, the distribution amongst the states is referred to as horizontal devolution formula. This is the most important recommendation given by any finance commission which has been set up post-independence India. But apart from these particular recommendations for devolution, Finance Commission will also grant certain funds for Panchayat Raj institutions. But basically understand this, the funds will not directly go from central government to the PRIs. What happens is the central government will allocate it to the state treasury and the states will have to allocate it to different panchayats in the state. But for this to happen, the state government has to set up the State Finance Commission. So this particular issue was there in the newspaper because an expert has written that certain things have to be implemented in the coming days because the recommendation of 15th Finance Commission are going to be announced soon. So what can be done to ensure that whatever funds are allocated under the Finance Commission will reach the Panchayat Raj institution? This article is related to that. So what is the analysis? First point, all the state governments have not set up the Finance Commission after 5 years. Various states have set it up. Various states have basically gone on postponing. Second, in various states, the Finance Commission have been set up. the finance commissions have given recommendations to the government, but the government has not introduced the report in the legislature. And since it has not introduced, there is no discussion, no devolution. Third, in some of the states, the report has been submitted, a report has been introduced in the legislature, discussion has happened, the state government has said we will implement it. But the states have not implemented all the recommendation, or some states have implemented very few recommendations. For example, the state of Karnataka has implemented around 11% of the recommendation of SFC. Some of the states such as West Bengal have implemented half of the recommendation. A state such as Kerala has implemented all the recommendation of the SFCs. Fourth, since a majority of the funds are devolved under these particular recommendation are in the form of untied funds, there is a huge problem of finances at the third tier. Third tier, that is Panchayat Raj institutions, are not given all the taxation powers that are supposed to be handed over to them. As a result of this, either partly dependent for finances on the state government or completely dependent on the state government. For example, in case of Uttar Pradesh, the third tier of government is completely dependent on the state government finances itself, compared to a state of Kerala, where the Panchayat Raj institutions are collecting a substantial part of their own receipts. So these are some of the issues that are plaguing the functioning of the Panchayat Raj institution. So what is the way out? This particular committee says that, one, there should be a mandate which should be fixed by 15th Finance Commission in its report. In what way? It recommends that, what if the Finance Commission recommends that all the states which will transfer these kind of finances to, let's say, urban local bodies or rural local bodies will be incentivized. If these incentives are given, then the state government might start giving more and more finances to the third tier. Or it is also recommended that we can use some of the tools which are used by the central government, such as PFMS, Public Financial Management System, which will ensure the real-time tracking of transfer of these particular funds. So these are the recommendations which have been given in this particular article. So please go through this article. The next article is related to infrastructure financing, or the need for infrastructure financing in India. Very recently, the finance minister has stated that in the next couple of years, the need for infrastructure financing or the financial needs will be more than $1.5 trillion. That is approximately more than 50% of total India's GDP. So in the present context, there is a huge need of studying what is the problem with respect to infrastructure financing in India. What could be the solution? This article gives a glimpse of it. Some of the important points are, the first one, infrastructure financing. Usually we'll use the term long gestation period. Whenever you use infrastructure financing, we'll use the term long gestation period. What is the meaning of this? Imagine I'm a road developer. To construct 100-kilometer stretch of a road, the time period it will take will be very long. And second, the financing or the money investment will be made completely. That is, let's say 100-kilometer stretch of road, 100 crore rupees. Even before I can ensure that a car will travel on this particular road and I can collect tolls on it, I will have to spend all the 100 crore rupees. That is the precise reason we use the term long gestation period. Time period taken to complete the project will be very long, and all the money or all the investment has to be made even before you can get a returns of 1 rupees. So that is the concept of infrastructure financing. Earlier, we saw that the UPA government promoted the concept of a PPP, public-private partnership, wherein both Government of India or the Ministry of the Government and the private sector will come together, sign model concession agreement and will implement this particular project. This particular project has been very successful in sectors such as road sector. But in all the other sectors, there have been certain issues with respect to these PPP infrastructure projects, such as there have been large scams which have been unearthed, that is, corruption cases have been filed under it. The Government of India has not stood by the agreement. The private sector has gone for a dispute resolution many of the times. The land acquisition has been a problem. Many of these infrastructure projects have stalled over a period of time because of various issues. That is the precise reason the PPP model, to a certain extent, was not followed by the present government. Rather, they went for the direct investment, that is, the Government of India investing directly in these particular infrastructure projects, expecting that over a period of time, since the investment is done by Government of India, the private sector investment will also get revived. But this has not happened in case of India. The private sector even today is not investing up to the expected standards. That is a precise reason, even though we expected the investment of around $1 trillion rupees in the 12th 5-year plan, that is from 2012 to 2017, we have not been able to meet this particular investment in the infrastructure. So what is the problem presently? The problem is asset liability mismatch. What has happened is, let's say one example, here is a company, it has issued, let's say a commercial paper and has collected money worth 100 rupees, but it has continued to invest in an infrastructure project. The problem with this kind of a modeling is that the commercial paper will be matured within 1 year, whatever the duration is, but it will be definitely within 1 year. Whereas this particular infrastructure project will only give the returns for this particular company after many years. So this particular situation where asset will give the returns after many years, whereas the liability will be matured within a short period of time, is called as asset liability mismatch. The banks are suffering because of ALM, as well as a company such as Island FS, which was mainly involved in lending for infrastructure project, is suffering because of ALM. As a result of this, now the demand for these kind of a short instruments is increasing. The interest rates on these short instruments is increasing, but this is not the way to finance the infrastructure, which will again lead to asset liability mismatch in the coming days. This particular article conducts a discussion with respect to this issue itself. So what is the way out? Way out of this will be, this article says that we will have to promote more and more investments in infrastructure through the concept called as sovereign wealth funds. For example, in case of India, there is a sovereign wealth fund called as NIIF, National Investment Infrastructure Fund, whose investment cap is around $6 billion, and into which the Government of India has made the investment or has provided the capital. Other sovereign wealth funds from Singapore as well as Abu Dhabi also have made contribution, and these funds will be used to provide infrastructure financing. But the issue is that even this 6 billion is much lesser than 1.5 trillion which has been estimated by the finance minister himself. And second issue is there is always a limit on how much Government of India can make in the form of investment into these particular funds. So basically this article discusses these issues. The next article is related to demand for GST on the services provided by the banking correspondent. Now, what is the concept of a banking correspondent or bank sathi? Please understand this. Let's assume this is the taluka headquarters, or let's say a city. This particular city will be surrounded by smaller villages or hamlets which will have small populations. Logic is the bank cannot open a brick and mortar branch or a physical bank branch unit in all these particular villages. Why? It will be very costly compared to the mobilization of the deposits that can be done in each of the villages. But then the bank cannot simply say that we will not provide you any of the banking services. So what these particular banks do, which are located here, is they will appoint a person who will go to each of the village, conduct a basic banking transaction such as remittance services, deposit services, the withdrawal services, as well as let's say application of a loan, so on and so forth. These services which are provided by a correspondent called as banking correspondent. He is also referred to as bank sathi. Now, issue in case of India already has been that the coverage of a banking correspondent has not been very satisfactory. That is, a banking correspondent density ratio is very poor in case of India. That is one of the reasons when on the Government of India side, they are promoting the idea of financial inclusion, we have not been able to provide all the financial services to the rural India. Upon that, very recently there has been a demand on imposing the GST on the earnings done by the services provided by this banking correspondent. What usually happens is, let's assume here's a banking correspondent. He will go to a village, let's say especially to a household, will provide the remittance services to this particular household. And on the remittances services provided to the household, on the value of the amount, this particular banking correspondent will impose a maximum amount of a commission of 1.5%. 1.5% of what? 1.5% of the value of the transaction. And In this particular 1.5%, he will pay part of it to the bank and the remaining will be his commission. I'll repeat it. Out of 1.5%, he will pay part of it to the bank and remaining will be his commission. He will be given the commission for a simple reason. The banks say that since he is not providing any of the core banking solutions or core banking services to the rural India, he is not on a full-time role or full-time employee of a bank. And since he is not a full-time employee, I will ensure that he will get the remuneration in the form of commission. Now, whatever earnings is done by the bank from this 1.5%, they are paying part of it in the form of a GST. They are paying the GST on it. But very recently, there has been a demand that even on the earnings of a banking correspondent, there should be a GST imposed. That is a precise reason why this particular issue was in the newspaper. But what is the issue with respect to imposition of these kind of the GST on the commission earned by the banking correspondent? On one side, the government of India is promoting the idea of a financial inclusion. Now, if this goes ahead, that is, the government starts collecting GST even on the commissions earned by the banking correspondent, some of the banks as well as various institutions are saying, we have to discontinue this particular concept of a banking correspondent. For a simple reason, the banking correspondent's earnings will fall down. He will start demanding more and more commission, but RBI has basically stacked or imposed a ceiling of 1.5% of the value of a transaction. So the banks have to discontinue this particular concept of a banking correspondent. And if they stop serving the rural India, this will affect the financial inclusion goal of Government of India. Second, the banking correspondent units do not earn more than 20 lakh rupees per annum. And since they don't earn 20 lakh rupees, they are very well within the exemption limit under GST. That is, under the concept of GST, those units which are earning lesser than 20 lakh rupees did not come under the ambit of GST. And second point, as already mentioned, the earnings of a banking correspondent are only in the form of the commission that they are earning. And if the Government of India imposes a GST even on this, their earnings would be falling substantially. So this is the analysis of this particular article. The next article is related to the import tariffs which have been announced by Government of India on 19 imports coming into India. Now recently, we've already seen that the current account deficit has ballooned to more than 2.5% of GDP, and there is every possibility that it will be more than 3% in the present financial year itself. To reduce the trade deficit, to reduce the current account deficit, to reduce the dollars flowing out of India, the Government of India very recently has prepared a list of non-essential commodities and has started imposing tariffs on these particular non-essential commodities. In the first round, they have basically imposed tariffs on 19 non-essential imports which are coming into India. In some of the cases, they have just been increased by certain percentages, and in some of the commodities, they have been doubled up. But whatever the argument is, let's try and understand the concept of import tariffs first. Now, import tariffs basically mean that these are the extra taxes which are imposed on the imports coming into the domestic market. The argument to impose these particular tariffs could be many, but the Government of India right now says that, one, we want to reduce the current account deficit, and second, we want to promote the domestic production of these particular commodities. Second, the concept of import tariffs will be hindering the bilateral trade or multilateral trade. And various countries have already raised certain issues with respect to these tariffs. And we are seeing this kind of a tariff imposition will always lead to protectionism. And we are seeing what is the impact of this particular protectionism across the global market because of these measures being implemented by a major consumer economy, that is USA. Concept of current account deficit. Current account deficit is a part of the balance of payments, which is nothing but the transactions which are conducted by one economy with the rest of the world. I'll repeat it. Balance of payments is nothing but a record of the transaction conducted by one country with the rest of the world, which basically tells you at the end of the day whether India should pay to the rest of the world or should India receive from the rest of the world. Now, what is the logic of imposing these particular the tariffs? We have already seen that. Now, this is the reason it was there in the newspaper. What is the analysis of it? will these tariffs which are imposed reduce the imports coming into India? Let's try and understand this. One, some of the experts have already stated that the tariffs imposed by Government of India are on the finished goods, such as white goods, refrigerators, ACs, so on and so forth. And since these are finished goods, these will come into India. And please understand this, when they come into India and the importer is paying a higher tariff, these will come costlier in India. So there is a danger that the expenditure on this will increase, which may also fuel the inflation in the market. That is one issue. Second issue, these particular imports formed only 3% of the value of the total imports for the last financial year. So in simple terms, these will not impact the current account deficit to a huge extent. Third, already 6 months are over and we are announcing these particular tariffs in the month of October. And since this is in the second half of the year, the impact of these particular tariffs in reduction of the current account deficit will be very minimal. So keeping in mind these particular issues, various experts have already stated that imposition of these particular tariffs is a retrospective move or is a regressive move. So what should Government of India do in this particular context? Is one, whatever businesses are moving away from China and entering into various other countries such as Bangladesh, Vietnam, so on and so forth, we should be able to attract them because we have got a huge presence of labor. Second, the manufacturing sector has not improved its performance in the last couple of months. We should be able to promote manufacturing in India and start exporting more and more from India to the rest of the world. This would basically reduce the current account deficit, the trade deficit, and also bring in a lot of dollars into the Indian market. Third, various reforms have to be done by Government of India within the balance of payments itself. Let's say within the capital account, such as full convertibility, to attract a lot of foreign investments into India. And fourth, the Government of India might also look at the concept of NRI bonds to attract a lot of dollars into Indian market. So these are some of the recommendations which have been given by various experts to control the slide of rupee depreciation, to control the expansion of current account deficit, as well as the balance of payment deficit, which India has incurred for the first time in the last 3 years. So these are some of the concepts associated with this particular article. So these are the articles which are important and have appeared in the last 1 week in the business related newspapers. Let's look at some of the questions. Question 1. The Government of India can reduce the fiscal deficit by 1. Borrowing from the market. Second, disinvestment policy. Third one, rationalizing the subsidies. We've already seen the first one, that is Government of India may issue G securities, borrow from the market, that will reduce the fiscal deficit. Second one, disinvestment policy, which basically covers selling part of the stake of a public sector enterprise or a majority of the stake in a public sector enterprise. Basically what happens? Let's say there is a public sector enterprise and 100% stake of this PSC is owned by Government of India. Let's say in this particular financial year, Government of India decides to sell 5% of the stake of this particular company. By selling this particular stake in the market, the Government of India will be able to collect a lot of money, which will be helping the Government of India's numbers to increase in the form of the receipts. And when the receipts will increase, obviously the fiscal deficit will come down. Third one, rationalizing the subsidy. One way of reducing the fiscal deficit is increase the receipts or incomes. Second way is obviously reduce your expenditure. So by rationalizing the subsidies, for example, Government of India is expanding the scope of DBT for various schemes. By rationalizing the subsidy, we can also reduce the fiscal deficit. So 1 is correct, 2 is correct, as well as 3rd is correct. Option D. Question number 2. Consider the following statements. Center and states both issue the treasury bills as well as dated securities. The debt of the states is higher than that of the center. Very important question. 1. Let's look at the first statement. Center and states both issue treasury bills as well as dated securities. Now, I'm using the term G securities. The G securities are of two types. One is called as the treasury bills and the second one is called as dated securities. What is the difference between both? Treasury bills will have a maturity period of up to 1 year and dated securities will have a maturity period of more than 1 year. So, treasury bills as well as dated securities, both are issued by the central government. Both are very well issued by the central government. But understand this, in case of the state government doesn't issue treasury bills. I'll repeat it. State government doesn't issue treasury bills, but they'll definitely issue securities which will have a maturity period of more than 1 year. These are called as SDLs, State Development Loans. So first statement is wrong. Let's look at the second statement. The debt of the states is higher than that of the center. Very recently, NK Singh committee report is there in the newspaper. Please go through the recommendations of NK Singh committee report. What this committee says is the general debt, that is the debt of central government as well as the state government, is somewhere around 69% to 70% of GDP in India. And out of this, around 47% is of the central government and around 22% is of the state government. This committee recommends that this has to be brought down to 40% and this has to be brought down to 20% in the next decade, 23-24. And the sum total of the central plus state, that is general debt, has to be brought down to 60%. So you can see in this particular issue that out of the total debt or the general debt in India, central debt is much higher than that of the state debt. So second statement is also wrong. So the right option will be both or false. Third question, CACP recommends MSP to CCA. We have already seen this. Commission for Agriculture Cost and Prices will recommend MSP to Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs. Correct. The government procures all the food grains that are covered under the MSP. Already we have mentioned this. The Government of India, though announces MSP for 23 agriculture commodities, it procures majorly rice and wheat. So second statement is wrong. So first is correct, second one is wrong. So option A, only one is true. And finally, descriptive questions. For your practice, I've given two descriptive questions and these are completely based on current affairs. One is MSP is a tool but not the solution to resolve the rural distress. Elaborate. Keeping in mind the farmer distress or agriculture distress as well as the farmer protest which have been happening in the last couple of months, and very recently in the month of October itself, the UPSC may start focusing on this particular question. So just have a look at this particular question and try to answer. So remember this, the descriptive questions in UPSC mains will either be asked for 150 words, 200 words or 250 words. I'm assuming a larger ceiling here, 250 words. So have a practice with respect to this question. Second one, the Constitution recognizes the third tier governance, there is a need of institutionalizing the devolution of finances to empower them. Discuss. Again 250 words. We've already discussed the issue with respect to State Finance Commission. This question is related to that. Okay. So these are the two questions under the descriptive head. So these are some of the very important issues that were there between 28th September to 4th October. The PPT of this will be uploaded in our website as well as the document related to this will also be uploaded. Please download the document. Have a practice with respect to these particular articles. Thank you. Have a good day.